Hello again, I am Blunty, your noob guide to being a noob in Monster Hunter Rise. My plan in this series is to explain the most important things fresh Monster Hunters need to know to save you from learning them the hard way, because these games aren't always super good at explaining their own systems, and veteran players / content creators often take certain knowledge for granted because, well, like a hot bath, you can just get used to the unpleasant part once the nice bit sets in. That was a terrible metaphor, but we're moving on. My video on which weapons are best for beginners guide was long and deep giggity because there was a lot to go over if we were going to do it properly. This time it's a bit less dense, but even more important because this is what you need to know once you start using your chosen weapon. I'd appreciate your appreciation with subs, thumbs, bells and comments, and for the love of God, please interact in some way. Comments especially lately have been left by a critically sad tiny percentage of viewers. Interactivity is life for content creators. Please, I am literally begging you. So, intro's done, begging is done. Let's take a bite of sharpness. Sharpness is easy. It's what it sounds like. Your weapon dulls over time with use, and you'll need to periodically sharpen it by selecting the whetstone item from your item bar or radial menu. And yes, it is pronounced whetstone. Please don't listen to people who say waystone or something ridiculous like that. They're probably the same kind of psychopaths who pronounce niche as niche. And before we go on, let's acknowledge the fact there are a couple of weapons, namely the bowguns and bow, that don't have sharpness gauges at all. They have ammo to manage instead. Secondly, yes, even the blunt weapons like hammers and the hunting horn use sharpness gauges. No, it doesn't make sense, it never has. Just do like I do and headcanon the sharpening procedure as cleaning the slippery monster guts off your handle for a better grip. It's the only way I can make my Asperger's brain survive the procedure. So, sharpen your weapon regularly during a hunt. The game actually tells you that much. Rise even has a voice line that pops off about it when it's time, which is nice and helpful. It doesn't mean you have to constantly keep one eye on the sharpness gauge. But when do you sharpen, and what happens when you don't? Sharpness level is represented by color bars in the sharpness gauge. From dullest to sharpest, it goes from red to orange, yellow, green, blue, and white. Some Monster Hunter games have another level, which is purple, but that's unlikely going to be in Rise, as purple is usually only in follow-up re-releases of games that include master rank weapons and monsters. Something else you need to know, not all weapons have every sharpness level available. Your starter and early game weapons will very likely only reach green sharpness. You'll earn your way to crafting sharper weapons as you progress through the game. Now, the important bits. Sharpness directly affects how much damage you do. At max white sharpness, you'll be doing about 1.3 times your weapon's rated base damage, and 1.15 times your weapon's elemental rated damage. Now, these numbers may slide up or down with Rise. I don't think we know for sure yet, but these are the numbers Monster Hunter World uses. And regardless of whether they stay the same, it's simply enough to understand that white sharpness does more than your rated base damage. So, as you can see, it's deeply in your interest to keep your weapon sharp. At the absolute least, you really don't want to dive into that yellow sharpness. Now, different weapons will lose sharpness at different rates, and it even comes down to which attacks you're using. Some attacks consume more sharpness than others. And different weapons, even within the same class of weapon, also have different amounts of any particular sharpness level. Some weapons will only have a very small amount of white sharpness, so you burn through it kind of quickly. Some will have lots, so you stay at max sharpness for longer. Some might have a big chunk of green sharpness right there in the middle, and comparatively smaller amounts of duller and sharpness on either side of it. Each weapon can be different, and it's very often balanced with other factors of that weapon, like its overall power, its affinity, which is something we'll get into in the next video, or its elemental or status effects. And it's usually the case that metal-based weapons stay sharp longer, while bone-based weapons dull faster. This is frequently balanced by bone weapons putting out more base damage per hit than metal ones. Just one more balancing act among the many, many carefully crafted balancing systems designed into this game. On top of just making sure you're putting out the most damage you can by keeping your weapon as sharp as possible, it's very often the case with certain monsters that you'll simply be unable to break parts or sever tails if your sharpness is too low. It can even come down to having your weapon completely bounce off the harder or armored parts of a monster, doing no damage at all and sending you into a vulnerable deflection knockback animation. So maintaining your sharpness is not just about raw damage output. Now, the real skill in managing sharpness is to choose when to sharpen, because it can be a big risk. Sharpening places you into an animation, you are completely open, completely vulnerable, and if the monster targets you, well, you can kiss your ass goodbye. You're gonna take it. So if you do have to sharpen in the middle of an encounter, choose when and where carefully. Try and find cover if you can. Get away from the monster. Hopefully your teammates and or your hunting pals, your Palico and your Palamute, will help you out by distracting the monster. The general technique is to range out, wait for the monster to go down on a trip or a trap, or when it's burned its stamina and it's just sitting there panting in its recovery animation. These are all the best chances for big damage combos too. So by choosing that moment to sharpen, you'll be sacrificing that opportunity for longer term practicality. Another balancing act. Like most things in this game, it's a careful risk versus reward balance of knowing when and where and how long your opportunities are. But that's also the old way to sharpen. In Rise, there's a new way, a better way. Because your doggo, your Palamute, you can mount it, ride it around, and sharpen at the same time, saving you from being locked in place and giving you a pretty good chance of effectively evading an attack should the monster decide to target you in that moment. And get into the habit of always sharpening immediately when the monster zones to a new location. As soon as that monster pieces out, sharpen. And of course, once more, if your Palamute is with you, you can actually sharpen while moving between map locations for much reduced downtime. Make it a habit. Make it instinct, because starting a new engagement with a half dull or even half sharp weapon is something you'll feel very dumb about doing. Or so I've been told. I've obviously never done that myself. I'm a smart person, not a complete derp sandwich with a side of oh come on fries and a big tall glass of ice cold really? So, that's the basics of everything you need to know about sharpness going into Monster Hunter Rise. There can be a bit more to consider, especially in armor and charm skills, some of which, like one called Mind's Eye, can make your weapon attacks successful when otherwise you might not be sharp enough and would otherwise bounce off the hit. But this and more you'll learn as you unlock these skills as you play through the game. And their in-game description is pretty clear about what they do, and by the time you get to them, you'll have enough of a base knowledge to understand what they do, so you won't need me to explain them to you. So hopefully you found this useful and or interesting. I am Blunty. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for making it to the end of the video, and thank you very much, as always, to the patrons scrolling up above there, whose above and beyond support is wonderful. I am Blunty. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.